The welder struck the arc at 10:14 in the morning. The permit was signed. The supervisor had annealed the form. The area had been checked, at least, that is what the paperwork said. But one line on that permit had been left blank. One checkbox. One gas reading that never happened. And because of that single gap, a flammable vapor that had migrated from a nearby drain was already sitting in the work zone when the ignition source arrived. What happened next took less than a second. The fire was reported within 2 minutes. 2 workers were taken off site. The unit was down for 11 days. And every investigation that followed arrived at the same quiet, devastating conclusion: the permit did not fail because no one cared. It failed because everyone assumed someone else had closed the loop. That blank line is where we are starting today. You might think permit-to-work failures are old news, something fixed after the big incidents of the 80s and 90s. They are not. The UK Health and Safety Executive published research report RR 982 specifically on permit-to-work systems, and it identified incomplete gas testing and poorly defined work areas as persistent, recurring failure modes, not historical ones. The CCPS, the Center for Chemical Process Safety, lists permit to work as one of the critical enabling conditions in their risk-based process safety framework. When it degrades, every other barrier around it becomes weaker. Think of it like a chain of locked gates. The permit is the master key. If the key is cut wrong, it does not matter how strong the other gates are. In the United States alone, OSHA's Process Safety Management Standard, 29 CFR 1910.119, requires safe work practices including permit systems at any facility handling threshold quantities of highly hazardous chemicals. There are more than 1,500 regulated facilities in the U.S. Every single one of them issues hot work permits. And in every single one of them, the gap we are about to describe is possible today, on the current shift, right now. You've been in this exact situation. The job is already running late. The scaffolding is up. The crew is ready. The isolations are confirmed. And someone hands you the permit and says, just get it signed, the area's been checked already. Maybe you were the one handing it over. Maybe you were the one receiving it. Either way, you know the feeling. The paperwork feels like the last obstacle between you and getting the work done. So the permit gets a quick scan. The boxes that are already filled get a nod. The empty ones get a question mark in your head, but the pressure of the queue behind you wins. Sound familiar? That moment, right there, is where the failure actually starts. Not at the point of ignition. Not when the fire alarm sounds. The failure starts the moment the permit becomes a formality instead of a genuine check. And the gas test section is almost always the first line to get treated as optional when time is short. That makes sense, because the most visible part of a permit-to-work system is the signature. The form has boxes. The boxes get filled. The supervisor signs. The area authority countersigns. It looks like a robust process. So when people think about why permits fail, they almost always point to one thing: someone did not follow the procedure. The operator cut a corner. The supervisor was distracted. The trainee did not know the rules. Fix the behavior, fix the problem. That is the standard diagnosis. But here is where the evidence pushes back hard. The UK HSE's research into PTW failures found that the most common root cause was not individual behavior, it was system design. Specifically, permit forms that did not clearly define the work area boundary, gas testing requirements that were ambiguous about frequency and location, and no independent verification step before the ignition source arrived. The Center for Chemical Process Safety puts it plainly: a permit is not a barrier. It is an enabling document. The real barriers are the physical isolations, the atmospheric testing, and the authorization chain. The permit is the record that those barriers are in place. When the permit is treated as the barrier itself, the actual barriers stop getting checked. That is the error. Not laziness. System design. So here's what most sites believe: gas testing is handled. The operator checked the atmosphere before the job started. The reading was below the lower explosive limit, the LEL, the concentration at which gas will ignite. The permit has a number written in the gas test box. The job is clear to proceed. Everything is fine. But here is what no one tells you: a single gas reading taken before work starts is not atmospheric testing. It is a snapshot. A photograph of one moment in one location. And the problem with flammable vapor is that it does not stay in one place. Think of it like smoke in a room with an open window. Close the window, and the smoke drifts back. In a process plant, drains, flanges, underground voids, and nearby equipment are constantly shifting the gas picture. The real barrier is not a number on a form. It is a continuous or repeated reading, taken at multiple locations, by a competent person, while the work is in progress. When facilities treat the pre-job reading as sufficient, they have removed the actual protection and replaced it with a record that looks identical on paper. The iChemy Learning from Incidents series, a publicly available compilation of process safety lessons from the chemicals and oil and gas industry, records permit-to-work failures as one of the highest frequency categories in its database. Across multiple reviewed incidents, the pattern is almost identical. Gas testing was performed once, at job start, at a single location. No repeat readings were required by the permit form. No independent gas watch was assigned. And in nearly every case, the vapor source that caused the ignition was from a secondary location, a drain, a low-lying void, a flanged joint, not the primary work area. The most surprising finding is this: in the majority of analyzed hot work incidents, the pre-job gas reading was genuinely clear. The atmosphere was safe when they checked it. The problem was that conditions changed during the work, and no one was watching. That single data point should change the way every team writes a hot work permit. In 3 minutes, you'll see the one mistake that destroys even people who know all of this. The CCPS bowtie model for hot work identifies atmospheric monitoring as an independent protection layer, a barrier with its own integrity requirements, its own test frequency, and its own competency standard. Treating it as a one-time checkbox removes an entire layer from the bowtie and leaves the others carrying a load they were never designed to carry alone. This works exactly like a smoke alarm with a dead battery. The alarm is physically present. It is in the right place. It passes the visual inspection. But when the smoke arrives, it does nothing. The permit-to-work failure mechanism runs in 3 clear steps. Step 1. The gas test is performed correctly before the job. The reading is genuinely clear. The work begins. This is not negligence, it is accurate at that moment. Step 2. A vapor source that was not present during the initial test becomes active. A drain valve that was closed is now open. A flange joint on a nearby line has started to weep under thermal cycling. The flammable atmosphere migrates toward the work zone. No one is monitoring continuously. The permit form does not require it. Step 3. The ignition source arrives before the atmosphere is rechecked. The gap between the last reading and the ignition event is exactly where the incident lives. The 2010 Tesoro Anacortes refinery incident in Washington state, investigated publicly by the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, the CSB, illustrates what happens when procedural barriers are treated as formalities. While that specific incident centered on high-temperature hydrogen attack, the CSB's findings described a broader pattern: barriers that existed on paper but had lost their functional integrity. 7 workers lost their lives. The CSB's core finding was about a management system that had normalized the gap between the written procedure and the actual practice. That normalization is the same dynamic that produces the blank line on the gas test form. Here is the mistake. Not the most dramatic one. The most common one. The gas test section of the permit specifies a location, for example, work area, 1 meter radius. The competent person takes the reading at that location. It is clear. They sign the form. The job starts. But the permit does not specify what happens if the scope of work drifts. In real field conditions, scope drift is almost universal. The welder moves 2 meters to reach an awkward joint. The scaffolding shifts the access point. The isolations are confirmed for the original work face, not the new one. And nobody reissues the permit because reissuing means stopping the job and waiting. Think of it like a sealed room that you checked for carbon monoxide before entering, but then someone opened a door on the other side. The reading you took is still written on your clipboard. It is still technically accurate for where you measured it. But the room has changed. The single most important field check, and the one most frequently skipped, is verifying that the gas test location and frequency on the permit still match the actual work location and conditions before every new phase of the task begins. Here's what closes Loop A and Loop D at the same time. 3 steps. Each one is a field action, not a policy statement. Step 1. Before any hot work permit is authorized, the issuing authority physically confirms the gas test locations on the permit form match the actual work footprint, not the planned footprint, the actual one. If the scaffold has changed the access point, the gas test location changes with it. This is a 2-minute conversation between the issuing authority and the area operator. It is the check that catches scope drift before it becomes invisible. Step 2. The permit specifies a retest interval, a time limit on how long the initial reading remains valid. Industry guidance from the CCPS and HSE recommends a maximum of 30 to 60 minutes for hot work in areas with credible vapor sources nearby. Write the retest time on the permit form. Make it a condition of the work continuing. Step 3. Assign a named gas watch. A gas watch is a person whose sole job during the hot work is atmospheric monitoring and communication. Think of it like a spotter in a sports team. Their only role is to see what the person doing the work cannot see. These 3 steps together restore the barrier that a single pre-job reading removes. They are not expensive. They take minutes. And they are the difference between a permit that looks safe on paper and one that is safe in the field. You now understand what 97% of people who work with hot work permits never figure out: the signature on the form is not the barrier. The barrier is a continuous, location-verified gas reading by a named competent person, with a defined retest interval and a gas watch assigned. Most teams never separate those 2 things. You just did. Sites that implement named gas watches and permit mandated retest intervals consistently report fewer ignition events during hot work, and the ones that do occur are caught before they escalate. That is not luck. That is a functioning barrier. If your site's hot work permit does not specify a retest interval and a named gas watch, that is your field question for the next shift briefing. Drop your answer in the comments. Does your permit require continuous monitoring, or just a pre-job reading? If this landed a real check you can use, hit like, leave that comment, and subscribe. 1 PSM failure pattern every week, built for operators, engineers, and anyone who wants to understand why things go wrong before they do.